He laughed in my face, in the middle of the lawyer's office. A parking lot? He said between chuckles. Well, at least now you'll finally have somewhere to sleep. That parking lot used to be part of our family's delivery company back in the 70s. Forgotten, fenced, rusted over. While Greg got my father's penthouse overlooking Central Park, the one I helped renovate when I was 22, I was given away, piece of cracked asphalt surrounded by chain-link fence in Red Hook, Brooklyn. I almost didn't go. I almost threw the keys away. But something about the way Dad had looked at me during our last lunch, the way he'd squeezed my hand like he was trying to say something without words, kept echoing in my mind. So I went. When I pushed open that rusted iron gate, expecting weeds and trash, I found something that made me drop my keys to the ground. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Margaret Sinclair, Maggie to everyone who matters. I'm 48 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I was just the dutiful daughter who put her life on hold to care for her father. Dad built Sinclair Logistics from nothing but a beat-up truck and a dream back in the 70s. By the time I was in college, he was worth millions. The day they read his will was the day I truly understood what it meant to feel betrayed. Not just by my cousin Greg, who always knew how to charm his way into Dad's good graces while I did the actual work, but by my father himself. Rain was pouring down outside the law office that morning, the kind of heavy New York rain that makes taxi drivers curse and pedestrians huddle under shop awnings. I remember how the water streaked down the marble walls of the building as I walked in, my black dress clinging to my legs, my sensible shoes squeaking on the polished floor. Greg was already there, of course. Perfectly tailored suit, not a hair out of place. He gave me that smile, the one that never quite reached his eyes, and squeezed my shoulder a little. Too hard. Maggie, he said, voice dripping with false sympathy. How are you holding up? This must be so hard for you. What he meant was, you're the one who watched him die. You're the one who changed his sheets when he couldn't make it to the bathroom. You're the one who sat in hospital waiting rooms while I was vacationing in St. Bart's. I'm fine, Greg, I replied, brushing his hand away. Let's just get this over with. Mr. Hargrove, Dad's attorney for over 30 years, looked uncomfortable as he arranged papers on the conference table. His assistant brought in coffee I wouldn't touch and pastries no one would eat. Shall we begin? He asked, not quite meeting my eyes. I should have known then. I should have seen it in the way he shuffled his feet, the way his voice dropped when he said my name. The legal language washed over me as he read, technical terms about estates and trusts and tax implications. I barely registered any of it until he cleared his throat and got to the specifics. To my nephew, Gregory Sinclair, I leave my Central Park West penthouse apartment, including all furnishings and art contained therein. Greg smiled. No surprise there. Dad had always made it clear the penthouse would go to family. Additionally to Gregory, I leave all shares and interests in Sinclair Logistics Company, along with all associated investment accounts and holdings. Wait, what? To my daughter, Margaret Sinclair, I leave Parcel 9A Industrial, located in Red Hook, Brooklyn, along with all contents and associated structures. That was it. After 48 years. After giving up my own dreams of traveling the world as a photographer. After postponing relationships and children and a life of my own to be there for him. A parking lot. A piece of cracked asphalt surrounded by a chain-link fence in Red Hook. The room spun. I gripped the edge of the table, feeling the cool mahogany against my palms. There must be some mistake, I managed to say, my voice sounding far away, even to my own ears. Mr. Hargrove shook his head. I'm afraid not, Ms. Sinclair. Your father was very specific. And then Greg laughed. That's the moment that replays in my mind, over and over. The way his head tilted back, the way his perfect white teeth caught the light, the way his eyes narrowed with undisguised triumph. A parking lot? He said between chuckles. Well, at least now. You'll finally have somewhere to sleep. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply stood up, took the envelope containing the deed and the rusty key that Mr. Hargrove held out to me, and walked out of the office without another word. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the city with that fresh-washed smell that never lasts more than a few minutes. I walked for hours, not caring where I was going. Eventually, I found myself sitting on a bench in Central Park, staring up at the luxury buildings that lined the perimeter. One of them housed the penthouse that should have been mine, the home I had helped Dad renovate when I was just out of college, picking out the marble for the bathroom, the wood for the floors. A small handwritten note had been included with the deed. Just one line in my father's shaky handwriting. She'll know what to do with it. What did that mean? What was I supposed to know? What could possibly be done with an abandoned parking lot in one of the most neglected parts of Brooklyn? For days, I didn't go. I couldn't bring myself to see the inheritance that had been deemed my worth. I stayed in my modest apartment in Queens, ignoring calls from family friends, from the few acquaintances who had heard the news and wanted to offer their condolences, or more likely, satisfy their curiosity about the fall of Maggie Sinclair. Then, a week after the reading, I dreamed of Dad. Not the frail old man who had died in a hospital bed, tubes running from every part of his body, but the Dad from my childhood, strong and tall, with calloused hands and a booming laugh. In the dream, he was standing in front of a gate, beckoning to me, that mischievous twinkle in his eye that always meant he had a surprise. I woke up at dawn, my heart pounding. I knew I had to go. I had to see what he'd left me, even if it was just to make peace with the fact that in the end, he had chosen Greg over me. The next morning, I took the subway to Red Hook, the industrial area. It was quiet on a Saturday. Most of the warehouses shuttered for the weekend. I followed the directions on the deed, walking past graffiti-covered walls and chain-link fences until I found it. Parcel 9A, a forgotten corner of what used to be our family's first delivery depot. The gate was rusted, the chain-link fence sagging in places. Weeds had pushed through cracks in the asphalt, and trash had collected in the corners. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a worthless piece of land that no one had cared about for decades. My hands shook as I tried the key in the padlock. It took several attempts, jiggling and pushing, before the mechanism finally gave with a reluctant click. The chain slithered through the gate with a metallic hiss, and I pushed it open. That's when I saw it. That's when I dropped my keys to the cracked asphalt beneath my feet, my mouth falling open in disbelief. In the center of the parking lot, partially hidden by overgrown weeds and decades of neglect, was a massive steel door built into the ground. It looked like the entrance to a bunker, with heavy-duty hinges and a sophisticated electronic keypad that seemed jarringly out of place amidst the decay. As I approached, my heart hammering against my ribs, a motion sensor camera I hadn't noticed before clicked to life, its small red light blinking at me from beneath a tangle of vines. The keypad lit up as I drew near, displaying a series of numbers that made my breath catch. 041777, my birthday. Dad, I whispered. What did you do? My fingers trembled as I pressed the enter key. For a moment, nothing happened. Then came a mechanical hum, followed by the sound of hydraulics engaging. The steel door began to rise, revealing a concrete ramp leading down into darkness. I should have been afraid. Any rational person would have hesitated before descending into an unknown underground chamber. But curiosity and a strange sense of hope propelled me forward. I took out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and began the descent. The ramp led to another door, this one requiring a fingerprint scan. I pressed my thumb against it, not really expecting anything to happen, but the light flashed green, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. What I saw inside took my breath away. Lights flickered on automatically, revealing a vast, climate-controlled space that extended far beyond what should have been possible under a simple parking lot. It was like stepping into another world, a secret vault that defied all my expectations. To my left stood a collection of vintage automobiles, their chrome and paint gleaming under the lights, as if they'd just rolled off the assembly line. I recognized my father's 1957 Chevy Bel Air, the car he'd always refused to sell even when times were tough. Next to it was a Ferrari Testarossa, a car I'd never seen before, and beyond that, several other vehicles that even my untrained eye could tell were valuable classics. On the right side of the space were rows of storage units, each one sealed and labeled with dates. Art pieces hung on the walls, original works by artists whose names I recognized from museum visits. In the center of it all stood a sleek desk with multiple computer monitors, all dark for now. "Welcome, Margaret," said a voice, and I nearly jumped out of my skin before realizing it was automated. Biometric identity confirmed, initiating primary protocols. The monitors on the desk came to life, displaying various security feeds, financial charts, and what looked like property deeds. Still in shock, I moved toward the desk, noticing a cream-colored envelope propped against one of the monitors. My name was written on it in Dad's handwriting, more steady than the note I'd received with the key. With shaking hands, I opened it and began to read. My dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, then you've figured out my final puzzle. I'm sorry for the deception, but I needed to be certain. Greg saw the wealth in front of him. You saw the man behind it. This is for you, Maggie. I knew only one of you would value what can't be flaunted. What you've discovered here is the true Sinclair legacy. Not the company that bears our name, but the fruits of 40 years of careful private investments. The cars, the art, the properties listed in the computer, all of it belongs to you now. I built Sinclair Logistics to prove something to a world that never believed in me. But what I created here, in secret, I built for love. For you. For the daughter who never asked for anything but my time. Greg will have what he always wanted. The appearance of success, the trappings of wealth that can be seen and envied. You have what matters, security that can't be taken away, and a chance to build something meaningful on your own terms. On the main computer, you'll find everything you need. Deeds to 5 properties across the country, all held in anonymous LLCs, crypto wallets and investment accounts totaling more than $20 million, and the details of a small vineyard in Northern California that I purchased in your name years ago. But most importantly, you'll find a video I recorded for you. Watch it when you're ready. I love you, Maggie. I always have. And I'm proud of the woman you've become. Not despite the sacrifices you made for me, but because of the heart that led you to make them. All my love, Dad. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face, before I could bring myself to look up at the monitors again. One of them displayed a video file, simply titled, "For Maggie." With a deep breath, I clicked play. My father's face filled the screen. Not the gaunt, illness-ravaged man of his final months, but Dad as he'd been maybe a year before his diagnosis. Strong, clear-eyed, with that half-smile that always made me feel like we shared a secret. "Hello, Maggie," he began. "If you're watching this, then 2 things have happened. I'm gone, and you've found your way to the truth. I'm sorry for the game I've played, but I needed to be sure." He shifted in his seat, leaning closer to the camera. "You see, I've watched you and Greg for years. I've seen how he comes around when he wants something, how he flashes his success like a badge of honor. And I've seen how you quietly show up day after day, expecting nothing in return. A father knows the difference between someone who loves him and someone who loves what he represents." Dad paused, taking a sip of water. "The company, the penthouse, they're all for show. I built them to prove something to a world that never thought I'd amount to anything. But this," he gestured to the space around him, the same space I was standing in now. "This is real. This is what matters. I've spent decades creating this safety net for you. Every time I closed a big deal, every time the company had a good year, I quietly siphoned off profits into investments that no one knew about. Not my accountants, not the board, and certainly not Greg." He chuckled, the sound so familiar it made my heart ache. "The official company will likely falter under Greg's leadership. He knows how to charm investors but not how to run a business. When it does, don't bail him out. Let him learn the lesson I never had the heart to teach him while I was alive." Dad's expression softened. "There's one more thing, Maggie. In the bottom drawer of the desk, you'll find plans I've had drawn up for the parking lot above. It doesn't have to stay an eyesore. I've set aside funds for you to transform it if you choose. Red Hook is changing. It could be something beautiful, something meaningful." He smiled, and for a moment, it was like he was right there with me. "I know you'll do the right thing, sweetheart. You always have. That's why everything that truly matters is yours now. Remember, wealth flaunted is merely borrowed. Wealth hidden is truly owned." The video ended, freezing on my father's smile. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything I'd just learned. Outside, in the world above, nothing had changed. Greg still had the penthouse. He still ran the company. As far as anyone knew, Maggie Sinclair had been disinherited, left with nothing but a worthless parking lot. But here, underground, everything had changed. Here I discovered that my father had seen me, truly seen me, all along. I opened the drawer he'd mentioned and found the plans: a community center with green space, learning facilities, and an art gallery, all hidden beneath the unassuming exterior of what everyone would still believe was just a parking lot. I laughed through my tears, finally understanding the message in his note. "She'll know what to do with it." "Yes, Dad. I think I do." For 3 days, I didn't leave the underground vault. I slept. On a surprisingly comfortable leather couch I found in a corner, showered in a small but luxurious bathroom hidden behind a bookshelf, and spent hours poring over the contents of my father's secret legacy. The computer systems revealed far more than I had initially realized. Dad hadn't just squirreled away money and collectibles, he'd created an entire shadow empire. The 5 properties included a beach house in the Hamptons, a mountain retreat in Colorado, a downtown loft in Chicago, a historic brownstone in Boston, and a small but elegant apartment in Paris, all held by different LLCs with varying degrees of separation from his public identity. The investment portfolio was brilliantly diversified. Blue-chip stocks, municipal bonds, early stakes in tech companies that had since exploded in value, and a significant cryptocurrency wallet that had appreciated beyond anything Dad could have anticipated. One folder contained detailed documentation of a venture capital fund that had backed promising startups across multiple industries. But it was the vineyard that brought fresh tears to my eyes. Located in Anderson Valley, it was smaller than the famous wineries of Napa but produced award-winning Pinot Noir under a label I'd never heard of. According to the files, Dad had purchased it 15 years ago, right after I'd mentioned in passing that I'd always dreamed of having a little place in wine country. He'd been listening. All those years when I thought he was absorbed in his business, distracted by expansion plans and quarterly reports, he'd been listening. On the morning of the 4th day, I finally emerged from the underground sanctuary, blinking in the harsh sunlight. I had a plan now, or at least the beginnings of one. My first call was to Veronica Blake, an estate attorney I'd met years ago at a charity event. I didn't know her well, but I remembered her sharp mind and no-nonsense approach. More importantly, she had no connections to my father or his business associates. I need someone discreet, I told her when we met at a small cafe far from Midtown, where the likelihood of running into anyone from my father's circle was minimal. What I'm about to share with you can't leave this table. Veronica listened without interruption as I outlined the situation, her expression changing from professional interest to genuine surprise. So, officially, you inherited a worthless parking lot, she summarized when I finished. But unofficially, you're sitting on an empire that no one, including your cousin, knows exists. Exactly. She tapped her manicured nails against her coffee cup, thinking. The legal structure is sound from what you've described. Your father was meticulous. But we'll need to verify everything. Make sure all the paperwork is in order. She leaned forward. What do you want to do with it all? I hadn't been asked what I wanted in so long that the question caught me off guard. What did I want? I want to honor my father's legacy, I said slowly. The real legacy, not just the company that bears his name. And I hesitated, then admitted the truth that had been forming in my heart since I'd discovered the vault. I want Greg to understand what he's lost, not just the money, but the chance to know who our father really was. Veronica nodded, a slight smile playing at her lips. So not revenge exactly, more like a reckoning. A reckoning, I repeated, liking the sound of it. Yes. My next call was to Edmund Eddie Sinclair, my father's most trusted financial consultant, and despite the shared last name, no relation to us. Eddie had always been kind to me, treating me with a respect that many of Dad's business associates hadn't bothered to extend to the daughter who chose caregiving over corporate climbing. We met at his office after hours, where I knew we wouldn't be interrupted. Maggie, he said warmly, embracing me. I was heartbroken when I heard about the will. It didn't sound like your father. At all. It wasn't, I replied, and proceeded to tell him everything. When I finished, Eddie was grinning from ear to ear. That crafty old fox, he said with admiration. I always knew he was playing a deeper game than most people realized. But this, he shook his head, chuckling. This is masterful. Will you help me? I asked. I need someone who understands finance. Someone I can trust. Of course I will, Eddie said without hesitation. What's the first step? I need to understand exactly what Greg has inherited with the company, the real state of things. Eddie's expression grew serious. It's not good, Maggie. The company looks solid on paper, but your father had been concerned about market changes for years. The logistics industry is transforming rapidly. Automation, AI, new. Players disrupting traditional models. Sinclair Logistics hasn't kept pace. So Greg has inherited a sinking ship. A ship that could still be saved with the right leadership and investment, Eddie clarified. But based on what I've seen of Greg's business acumen, he left the thought unfinished. I nodded. understanding perfectly. Greg had always been more concerned with appearances than substance. He knew how to talk the talk in boardrooms and at cocktail parties, but the actual day-to-day grind of running a business, that had never been his strong suit. I need you to keep your position at the company, I told Eddie. Be Greg's advisor, just as you were Dad's, but keep me informed of everything that happens. Eddie raised an eyebrow. You're not planning to let Sinclair logistics fail? No, I said firmly. That company was my father's first dream. It employs hundreds of people who depend on those paychecks. I won't let it collapse just to teach Greg a lesson. I paused, but I won't rescue it immediately either. With Veronica and Eddie on board, I turned my attention to the parking lot itself. Dad's plans for a community center were ambitious but brilliant. Red Hook had been neglected for decades, but it was beginning to see the first waves of revitalization. A well-designed community space could be transformative for the neighborhood. I hired an architect specializing in urban renewal projects, sworn to secrecy about the underground vault. Together, we refined Dad's vision, creating a plan that would preserve the hidden sanctuary below while transforming the surface into something the community desperately needed. All the while, I maintained my low profile. I didn't change my apartment, my car, or any outward sign of my circumstances. As far as the world was concerned, as far as Greg was concerned, I was still the disinherited daughter, working through my grief and disappointment in private. But beneath that carefully maintained facade, I was building something extraordinary. 3 weeks after the reading of the will, Greg called me for the first time. Maggie, he said, his voice strained despite his attempt at casualness. How are you? I've been meaning to check in. I'm fine, Greg, I replied coolly. What can I do for you? He cleared his throat. Well, I've been going through Uncle Rick's papers, and there seem to be some discrepancies in the accounts. I was wondering if you might know anything about some investments he made in the last few years. So it had begun. Greg was discovering that the company wasn't quite the goldmine he'd expected. I'm afraid I can't help you, I said, working to keep any trace of satisfaction from my voice. Dad never discussed the financial details of the business with me. Right, Greg said, trying to hide his frustration. Well, if you remember anything, let me know. And, how's that parking lot working out for you? The familiar condescension in his tone ignited a brief flare of anger, but I tamped it down. Patience, I reminded myself. This is a long game. It's a parking lot, Greg, I said flatly. It's working out exactly as you'd expect. After hanging up, I returned to the blueprint spread across my kitchen table. The community center design was coming together beautifully. We'd incorporated green space, learning facilities for after-school programs, and a small but state-of-the-art gallery where local artists could showcase their work. The next day, I had my first meeting with community leaders in Red Hook. I didn't reveal the full extent of my plans. The underground vault would remain my secret for now, but I shared the vision for the community center. Why here? Asked Daniela Rodriguez, a longtime neighborhood activist. Why Red Hook? And why now? I could have given her a sanitized answer about community investment and urban renewal. Instead, I told her the truth, or part of it. My father left me this property when he died. It's all I have of him now. I want to transform it into something meaningful, something that honors who he really was, not just the successful businessman everyone saw. Daniela studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, Ms. Sinclair. You seem sincere. But we've had developers come in here before with big promises and bigger egos. They see Red Hook as a place to make money, not as a community of real people with real needs. I understand, I said, and I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. Judge me by my actions, not my words. As I drove home that evening, I felt a sense of purpose stronger than anything I'd experienced since before Dad's illness. The path ahead was clear now. Transform the parking lot. Build something meaningful for the community. Monitor Sinclair. Logistics through Eddie. And wait for the right moment to reveal the truth. Greg might have the penthouse and the corner office, but I had something far more valuable. Time and a plan. Dad had taught me well, even when I didn't realize I was learning. 6 months passed in a blur of activity. The parking lot transformation began with little fanfare, a few construction vehicles, modest improvements. To the fencing, nothing that would draw undue attention. To casual observers, it looked like basic maintenance rather than the beginning of something significant. Below ground, I worked with a small team of trusted contractors to modernize the vault's systems, and catalog its contents properly. The value of Dad's collection was staggering. The cars alone were worth millions, and some of the art. Pieces had appreciated tremendously since his initial purchases. Eddie kept me informed about developments at Sinclair Logistics. As he'd predicted, Greg was struggling. His leadership style, a combination of delegation and intimidation, was creating friction among the executive team. Several key employees had already left for competitors, taking their institutional knowledge with them. "He's burning through cash reserves," Eddie reported during one of our regular meetings. "Fancy office renovations, a new corporate jet, lavish client dinners, all while revenue is declining quarter over quarter." "What about the penthouse?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. Eddie grimaced. "Property taxes alone are eating him alive, plus maintenance, staff, utilities. That place was never meant to be a bachelor pad, Maggie. Your dad could afford it because he was disciplined about finances. Greg," he shook his head, "let's just say he has different priorities." I took no pleasure in hearing about Greg's difficulties. Well, perhaps a small petty part of me did, but mostly I worried about the employees whose livelihoods depended on the company's survival. "How much time does he have?" I asked. "At the current burn rate? Maybe another year before serious problems start. 2 at the outside." I nodded, making mental notes. My timeline would need to accelerate. The next day, I received an unexpected visitor at the parking lot. I was meeting with the architect when a sleek black Porsche pulled up outside the fence. Greg stepped out, looking immaculate as always in a tailored suit, designer sunglasses hiding his eyes. Well, he called as he approached the gate. "Looks like you're actually doing something with this dump." I excused myself from the architect and walked over, keeping my expression neutral. "Hello, Greg. What brings you all the way to Red Hook?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Can a concerned cousin check in? I was curious what you were up to." "Out here. Just some basic improvements," I said casually, making the space more usable. Greg peered past me at the construction activity. "Seems like a lot of work for a parking lot. Must be costing you." There it was, the fishing for financial information. I wondered how desperate he was becoming. "I manage," I said simply. "How's the company?" A flicker of tension crossed his face before his smile reasserted itself. "Booming, making changes, streamlining operations. You know how it is in business, always evolving. Corporate speak for, we're cutting costs wherever possible." "And the penthouse?" I asked. "Everything you dreamed it would be?" "Absolutely," he said with forced enthusiasm. "Best view in the city. You should come by sometime, see what you're missing." The petty dig might have hurt months ago. Now, knowing what I knew, it was almost amusing. "I'm pretty busy here," I replied, "but thanks for the invitation." Greg lingered, clearly hoping I'd reveal more about my finances or plans, but I kept the conversation light and vague. After a few more minutes of awkward small talk, he left, the Porsche's engine roaring as he accelerated away. "Who was that?" the architect asked when I returned. "The past," I said simply, and turned back to the blueprints. 2 weeks later, I launched the Sinclair Legacy Foundation with a modest press release that barely made a ripple in the business news. The foundation's stated mission was to support community development in underserved neighborhoods, with a focus on education, arts, and entrepreneurship. I funded it with $5 million from my hidden accounts, a significant sum, but just a fraction of what I had available. The real purpose of the foundation, beyond its genuine charitable aims, was to establish a public entity that could later be revealed as the driving force behind the Red Hook Community Center. The announcement didn't escape Greg's notice. He called that evening, his voice tight with suspicion. "A foundation? Where did you get that kind of money, Maggie?" "Hello to you too, Greg," I replied calmly. "The foundation is being funded by a group of private investors who share my vision for community renewal." "What investors? Who?" The demand in his tone was unmistakable. "I'm afraid that information is confidential. Some of our backers prefer to remain anonymous." Greg's silence spoke volumes. He was connecting dots in his head, trying to make sense of a situation that increasingly didn't align with his understanding of my financial state. "You know," he said finally, his voice taking on a casual tone that I recognized as dangerous. "It's interesting how you suddenly have access to this kind of funding right after Uncle Rick's death. Makes me wonder if there might be some irregularities in how his estate was handled." My heart pounded, but I kept my voice steady. "Are you accusing me of something, Greg?" "Not at all." He backpedaled quickly. "Just making an observation. I'd hate to think there might be legal complications down the road. The threat was thinly veiled but clear. If I had resources he didn't know about, he wanted to share, or he'd cause problems. I appreciate your concern, I said coolly, but everything is in perfect legal order. You can be sure of that. After hanging up, I called Veronica immediately to warn her about Greg's suspicions. She was unconcerned. Let him dig, she said confidently. Every LLC, every account, every property is properly documented and legally distinct from your father's public estate. He can hire all the investigators he wants. He won't find the connections unless we choose to reveal them. Her confidence reassured me, but I knew Greg wouldn't give up easily. He'd always been tenacious when he thought something was being kept from him, especially something of value. As autumn arrived, the community center project moved from planning to active construction. We held a small groundbreaking ceremony, attended by local officials and community members. I kept my remarks brief, focusing on the future rather than the past, never mentioning my father or the true extent of what lay beneath our feet. The local press covered the event favorably, with one reporter from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle writing a particularly insightful piece about the project's potential impact on the neighborhood. The article included a quote from Daniela Rodriguez, who had become one of the center's most vocal supporters. Ms. Sinclair isn't just talking about community investment. She's putting in the work, listening to residents, and creating something that actually addresses our needs. I had the article framed and hung it in the vault, next to Dad's photo. That night, as I sat at the desk in my underground sanctuary, reviewing the latest financial reports from Eddie, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I know what's under the parking lot. We should talk. Tomorrow, noon, at the River Cafe. My blood ran cold. Someone knew my secret. But who? And how much did they know? I considered my options. Ignore the message and hope it was a bluff. Consult with Veronica or Eddie first. Neither. Felt right. This was my father's legacy. My responsibility. I needed to face this directly. I'll be there, I texted back, and tried to prepare myself for whatever would come next. The River Cafe glittered at midday, sunlight dancing across the East River and illuminating the Manhattan skyline beyond. Despite the breathtaking view, my attention was fixed on the entrance, watching each person who walked through the door with mounting anxiety. I'd arrived 30 minutes early, requesting a table in the corner where I could observe without being easily observed. I wore a simple navy dress, pearl earrings that had belonged to my mother, and a composed expression that belied the storm of questions raging within. Who knew about the vault? How had they discovered it? Was this blackmail, or something else entirely? At precisely noon, my answer walked through the door. Tall, silver-haired, with the ramrod-straight posture of someone who had spent time in the military, Thomas Reeves had been my father's driver and personal security for over 20 years. I hadn't seen him since the funeral. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by new questions. Thomas had never been to the vault, as far as I knew. How had he learned about it? Ms. Sinclair, he said formally as he approached the table. Thank you for meeting me. Thomas, I replied, gesturing to the chair across from me. I think under the circumstances, you can call me Maggie. He smiled slightly but didn't relax his posture as he sat down. Old habits. The waiter appeared with menus, but Thomas waved his away. Just coffee for me, thank you. I ordered the same, too anxious to contemplate food. When the waiter departed, Thomas leaned forward slightly. I apologize for the cryptic message. I couldn't risk being more explicit. How do you know about the vault? I asked directly. Your father told me. Thomas's expression softened with what might have been nostalgia. Not all at once, but over the years. Richard Sinclair was a careful man, but even careful men need someone to trust with their secrets. He never mentioned you being involved. That was by design. Your father compartmentalized his life meticulously. The fewer connections between the different pieces, the safer each piece remained. The waiter returned with our coffees. We both waited until he was out of earshot before continuing. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Thomas reached into his jacket and withdrew a small envelope, placing it on the table between us. Because it's time you had this. I opened the envelope with careful fingers. Inside was a small silver key, unremarkable except for the number etched into its surface. 42. There's a safe in the vault, Thomas explained quietly. Behind the painting of the lighthouse in Maine, the one your mother loved. This key opens it. My throat tightened with emotion. I knew the painting well. Dad had bought it the summer we rented a cottage in Bar Harbor. The last vacation we took as a family before Mom's accident. What's in the safe? I don't know the specifics, Thomas admitted. But your father said it contained evidence. Insurance, he called it. He made me promise that if anything ever happened to him under suspicious circumstances, I should make sure you received this key. A chill ran through me. Suspicious circumstances? Dad died of cancer. Thomas nodded. Yes, he did. But in his final months, he became concerned. About Greg, primarily. About what Greg might do once he realized the company wasn't what he thought it was. What kind of insurance could Dad have possibly needed against Greg? Richard never shared the details with me, but he was adamant that you should have access to it if needed. Thomas paused, choosing his words carefully. Your father was an exceptional judge of character, Ms. Sinclair. Maggie, if he thought this was necessary, he had his reasons. I slipped the key into my purse, my mind racing. Thank you for bringing this to me, but I'm still not clear on why now. It's been over 6 months since Dad died. Thomas's expression darkened slightly. Because Gregory has been asking questions about your father's movements in his final years, about properties and accounts that might not have been included in the official estate. He approached me last week, offering a substantial sum for information. My stomach tightened. What did you tell him? Nothing of value, Thomas assured me. I maintained that my duties were strictly professional, that your father never discussed business with me, but the fact that he's digging and willing to pay for information suggests he suspects something. He's noticed the foundation, I acknowledged. He's wondering where the money came from. Thomas nodded, grimly. And Gregory is not a man who likes unanswered questions, especially when money is involved. You should prepare yourself, Maggie. This is likely just the beginning of his investigation. After lunch, I drove straight to the vault. The parking lot above was busy with construction workers, the community center project now visibly taking shape. I slipped through a temporary doorway, hidden. Behind stacks of building materials, descended the ramp, and entered my secret sanctuary. The painting of the main lighthouse hung on the far wall, exactly where it had been since I discovered the vault. I'd always assumed Dad had placed it there for sentimental reasons, a reminder of happier times. Now I understood it had a more practical purpose as well. I removed it carefully from the wall, revealing a small wall safe with a simple keyhole. The silver key slid in perfectly, turning with a soft click. Inside was a single USB drive and a handwritten note in my father's distinctive script. For Maggie, only if necessary. The password is the name of the stuffed bear you couldn't sleep without when you were 6. Mr. Snuggles, a childhood companion I hadn't thought about in decades. I took the drive to the computer station, plugged it in, and entered the password when prompted. The drive contained a single folder labeled Oversight. Inside were hundreds of files, emails, financial records, meeting minutes, and recorded conversations, all meticulously organized and dated. It took me hours to understand what I was seeing, but when I did, my blood ran cold. The files documented years of questionable business practices at Sinclair Logistics, not by my father, but by Greg. Tax discrepancies, misleading reports to investors, deals with companies that, upon closer inspection, appeared to be shells for moving money offshore. Dad had been monitoring Greg's activities within the company for years, gathering evidence of every ethical breach, every corner cut, every rule bent. It wasn't enough to send Greg to prison, perhaps, but it was certainly enough to destroy his reputation and possibly trigger investigations by the SEC or IRS. This was the insurance Thomas had mentioned, a nuclear option, to be used only in the most dire circumstances. I sat back in the chair, my mind reeling. Dad had given me more than just wealth and property. He'd given me leverage, protection against whatever Greg might try to do when he finally realized the extent of what he'd been denied. But the knowledge brought no joy, only a heavy sense of responsibility. Using this information would devastate not just Greg, but potentially the company as well. Hundreds of innocent employees could lose their livelihoods if Sinclair Logistics collapsed under the weight of scandal. I closed the files and removed the drive, returning it to the safe. This was a weapon of last resort, not something to be deployed lightly or in anger. The next morning, I received a call from Eddie. His voice was tense, lacking its usual warmth. Maggie, we need to talk. In person. Today if possible. What's wrong? Not over the phone. Meet me at Prospect Park by the boathouse in an hour. I'll be there. Eddie was already waiting when I arrived, pacing nervously along the water's edge. He looked over his shoulder as I approached, then gestured to a bench partially hidden by trees. Greg hired a private investigator, he said without preamble once we were seated. To look into you, your finances, the foundation, everything. I'm not surprised, I replied, thinking of Thomas's warning. He's been suspicious for months. This is different, Eddie insisted. He's not just curious anymore, he's desperate. The company's in worse shape than I realized. We lost the Jensen account yesterday, our biggest client. Without that revenue. He shook his head grimly. Greg's looking at serious cash flow problems within weeks, not months. And he thinks I somehow have access to money that should be his, I concluded. Exactly. He's convinced your father must have hidden assets somewhere, and that you've found them. He's determined to prove it. I considered my options. The community center project was too far along to hide, and the foundation was already public knowledge. But the vault, the properties, the investment accounts, those could still be protected. Thank you for the warning, I told Eddie. I'll be careful. There's more, Eddie said, lowering his voice further. Greg's been meeting with lawyers, not just Hargrove, but others, specialists in estate litigation. I think he's preparing to challenge the will. This was a complication I hadn't anticipated. While Dad's secret holdings were legally separate from his official estate, a court battle could expose connections I'd prefer to keep hidden. On what grounds? I asked. The will was clear and properly executed. Undue influence, probably. He'll claim you manipulated your father during his illness, that the will doesn't reflect his true intentions. Eddie looked pained. It's a despicable strategy, Maggie. Everyone who knew your father knows how much he loved you, how grateful he was for your care. But it could tie things up in court for years, I observed, and force financial disclosures in the meantime. Eddie nodded grimly. That's the plan, I think. Even if he eventually loses, he's hoping to discover hidden assets in the process, or pressure you into a settlement. I thanked Eddie for his loyalty and discretion, assured him I would take precautions, and walked back to my car with a heavy heart. The game was changing. Greg was no longer just suspicious. He was on the offensive. That evening, I called an emergency meeting with Veronica in the vault. After bringing her up to speed on both Thomas's warning and Eddie's intelligence, I asked the question that had been haunting me all day. How vulnerable are we? If Greg challenges the will, could the court force me to disclose the contents of the vault, the other properties? Veronica considered the question carefully. The legal separation your father created between his public assets and his private holdings is robust. But litigation is always unpredictable, and judges have broad discretion in discovery. So we could be compelled to reveal everything. It's a possibility we have to consider, she acknowledged. But there's another approach we might take. I'm listening. Veronica smiled, a predatory gleam in her eye. Instead of playing defense, waiting for Greg to make his move, what if we change the game entirely? Change the game? I echoed, leaning forward. What do you mean? Veronica's smile widened. Greg's desperate because the company is failing. He needs money, and he thinks challenging the will might get him access to hidden assets. But what if the company suddenly had a mysterious benefactor? An anonymous investor offering to inject capital in exchange for partial ownership? I caught on immediately. Using my own money to buy into the company Dad already intended for me to have. Exactly. Not directly, of course. We'd create another layer of LLCs, route the investment through offshore accounts, make it impossible to trace back to you. But the effect would be the same. The company gets the cash it needs, Greg remains CEO for now, and you gain legitimate access to the company's inner workings. A Trojan horse, I murmured, warming to the idea. But wouldn't Greg be suspicious of a random investor appearing just when he needs one most? Not if we make him work for it, Veronica replied. We'll approach him through intermediaries, make the negotiation challenging enough that he feels he's earned the investment. His ego will do the rest. The plan was audacious, but the more we discussed it, the more sense it made. Instead of waiting for Greg's attack, we would change the battlefield entirely. I would become the company's savior, hiding in plain sight. Over the next 2 weeks, we set the plan in motion. Veronica created a complex network of shell companies, culminating in a Delaware LLC called Phoenix Capital Partners. Through a business broker she trusted, word reached Greg that a private equity firm was interested in mid-sized logistics companies with strong fundamentals but temporary cash flow issues. Eddie kept me informed of Greg's reaction. Initial skepticism, followed by desperate hope as the Jensen account loss began to ripple through the company's finances. The first meeting between Greg and Phoenix Capital's representatives, actually attorneys from Veronica's firm, was scheduled for a Friday afternoon at a neutral location, a conference room in a midtown hotel. I couldn't attend, obviously, but Eddie was there, ostensibly as Sinclair, logistics CFO, but actually as my eyes and ears. He was practically salivating, Eddie reported afterward. When they mentioned the possibility of a $10 million initial investment, I thought he might weep with relief. Did he ask questions about who's behind Phoenix Capital? Of course. They gave him the prepared response, a consortium of private investors who prefer to remain anonymous until formal agreements are signed. He pushed, but they held firm. The negotiations proceeded rapidly over the following week. Greg, eager to secure the funding before more clients jumped ship, agreed to terms that were actually quite favorable to Sinclair Logistics. Phoenix Capital would receive a 30% ownership stake in exchange for the investment, with an option to increase to 49% over the next 3 years. Greg would retain control as CEO, but Phoenix would appoint 2 members to the board of directors. It was these board seats that were my true objective. From that position, I could gradually influence company direction, protect employees' jobs, and eventually reveal my identity when the time was right. 3 days before the deal was set to close, I received an unexpected visitor at the parking lot. The community center construction was now well underway, with the exterior structure taking shape. I was discussing lighting options with the architect when a black SUV pulled up, and Greg emerged, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "Privately." I excused myself and led him to a small trailer that served as the site office. Once, inside, Greg paced the confined space like a caged animal. "What's going on, Greg?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "You look stressed." He stopped pacing and faced me directly. "The company's in trouble, Maggie. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. We've lost some key accounts, and there are cash flow issues." This candor was unprecedented. Greg had always projected an image of effortless success, even when things were falling apart around him. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said carefully. "But why are you telling me this?" "Because I need your help." The words seemed physically painful for him to utter. "I'm about to close a deal with an investment firm. It's a good deal, one that will save the company, but what? But something feels off." Greg ran a hand through his hair, further disrupting his usually immaculate appearance. "These investors, Phoenix Capital, they appeared out of nowhere, right when we needed them most. Their terms are reasonable, almost too reasonable, and they won't reveal who's actually behind the firm." I maintained a neutral expression despite my internal alarm. That sounds fairly standard for private equity. They often operate anonymously. "Maybe," Greg didn't sound convinced. "But there's more. They specifically asked for you to be present at the signing." My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't part of the plan. Veronica hadn't mentioned including me in the signing ceremony. Me? Why would they want me there? I have nothing to do with the company. Greg's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's exactly what I asked. They said they believe in family unity and want all Sinclairs present for a major transition in the family business." He studied my face intently. "Do you know something about this, Maggie? Have you been talking to investors behind my back?" "Of course not," I replied, the denial coming easily because it was technically true. I hadn't spoken directly to any investors. I was the investor. I haven't been involved with Sinclair Logistics since Dad died. You know that. Greg continued to watch me, skepticism evident in his expression. "Then you won't mind coming to the signing? Tomorrow at 2 p.m. at Hargrove's office." It was a trap, but one I couldn't avoid without raising even more suspicion. "If it helps the company, I'll be there." "Good." Greg seemed marginally relieved, though still wary. "One more thing. This community center project?" He gestured to the construction site outside. "It's impressive. More impressive than a parking lot inheritance should allow. People are starting to notice, to ask questions." "What people?" "Board members? Business associates? They wonder where the funding is coming from, why you're suddenly investing in real estate development." I kept my expression neutral. "The foundation is funding the project, Greg. It's all public record." "Yes, the mysterious foundation with its anonymous donors." His tone made it clear he didn't believe the official story. "Sooner or later, Maggie, the truth comes out. It always does." After he left, I immediately called Veronica. "We have a problem. Phoenix Capital requested I attend the signing tomorrow. What? Her surprise seemed genuine. I gave no such instruction. The representatives have strict orders to keep you completely separate from the transaction. Then someone went off script, I said grimly. The question is, why? And who's really behind it? I'll find out, Veronica promised. In the meantime, you have to attend. Refusing now would only increase Greg's suspicions. And if it is a trap? If someone has connected me to Phoenix Capital? Then we pivot, she said firmly. We've prepared for contingencies. Trust the legal structures we've put in place. They'll hold. The next day, I arrived at Hargrove's office 15 minutes before the scheduled signing. I wore a simple black dress, professional but understated, determined not to appear too invested in the proceedings. The reception area was, tense with anticipation. Greg paced near the windows, occasionally checking his watch. Eddie sat quietly in a corner, giving me a subtle nod of recognition. Mr. Hargrove himself looked uncomfortable, shuffling papers with unusual nervousness. At precisely 2 p.m., the elevator doors opened and 3 people stepped out. 2 men in expensive suits who I recognized as Veronica's associates, and a third figure who made my blood freeze. Thomas Reeves. He wore a tailored navy suit instead of his usual driver's uniform, but his military posture was unmistakable. His eyes met mine briefly, revealing nothing. Mr. Sinclair, one of the associates, greeted Greg with practiced cordiality. Thank you for accommodating our request to include Ms. Sinclair today. As we mentioned, Phoenix Capital values family cohesion in our investment partnerships. Greg shook hands automatically, but his attention was fixed on Thomas. Have we met before? He asked, frowning slightly. I don't believe so, Thomas replied smoothly. Thomas Reeves, senior partner at Phoenix Capital. Shall we proceed to the conference room? As we filed into Hargrove's lavish conference room, my mind raced. Thomas as a Phoenix. Capital partner. This was definitely not part of Veronica's plan. What game was he playing? The meeting began with standard formalities. Introductions, overview of the deal terms, legal disclosures. I said nothing, observing the interactions with growing anxiety. Greg kept glancing between Thomas and me, clearly trying to place where he might have seen Thomas before. Finally, as the signing moment approached, Thomas cleared his throat. Before we proceed, there's one modification to the agreement we'd like to propose. Greg tensed visibly. Modification? We've been negotiating for weeks. The terms are set. A small adjustment, Thomas assured him. In addition to the 2 board seats originally discussed, we'd like to nominate a 3rd member to represent Phoenix Capital's interests. That would give you equal representation to existing board members, Greg objected. It changes the balance of power significantly. Only if the board votes along investor lines, Thomas pointed out reasonably. And our nominee would bring valuable perspective to the company's operations. Who is this nominee? Greg demanded. Thomas smiled slightly. Margaret Sinclair. The conference room erupted into chaos. Absolutely not! Greg slammed his palm on the mahogany table. This is a setup. You 2 are working together. He pointed accusingly between Thomas and me, his face flushed with anger. I remained outwardly calm despite my racing heart. Greg, I'm as surprised as you are. Thomas maintained his composed demeanor. Ms. Sinclair wasn't aware of our intention to nominate her. We at Phoenix Capital make our decisions independently, based on thorough background research. Margaret's business acumen, community involvement, and intimate knowledge of the Sinclair family values make her an ideal board member. This is ridiculous, Greg sputtered. She has no experience in logistics, no corporate background whatsoever. On the contrary, Thomas countered smoothly. Ms. Sinclair practically grew up in the company. She witnessed its founding years, its growth phases, and its evolution under Richard Sinclair's leadership. That institutional knowledge is invaluable. Mr. Hargrove, who had been silently observing the exchange, finally spoke up. Mr. Sinclair, while unusual, there's nothing in the company bylaws that would prevent Mrs. Sinclair from serving on the board. And without this investment, he left the implication hanging in the air. Greg's eyes darted frantically around the room, seeking an ally and finding none. Even Eddie, though outwardly neutral, offered no support. We need to discuss this privately, Greg finally said, gesturing to the Phoenix Capital representatives. If you'll excuse us. Of course, Thomas agreed. Ms. Sinclair, would you join us outside? This discussion concerns you as well. Before Greg could object, Thomas had opened the door, ushering me into the hallway. The other Phoenix representatives followed, leaving Greg alone with Hargrove and Eddie. Once the door closed behind us, I turned to Thomas. "What are you doing?" I whispered urgently. "Executing the contingency plan," he replied calmly. "Your father anticipated this scenario. My father anticipated that Greg would run the company into the ground, and I'd need to save it with my own money while pretending to be an anonymous investor." Thomas's expression softened slightly. Richard understood his nephew better than you might think. He knew that giving Greg the company outright would be the quickest way to reveal his true character, and the surest path to you eventually assuming control. "And your role in all this? You're not really with Phoenix Capital." "No, but I've been managing a portion of your father's private investments for years. The money for this deal is coming from funds he specifically set aside for this purpose." Before I could respond, the conference room door opened, and Greg emerged, his expression a mixture of resignation and suspicion. "Fine," he said curtly. "Maggie can have the board seat, but I want full transparency from Phoenix Capital. No more secrets about who's behind this investment." Thomas nodded. "We can accommodate that request after the papers are signed." The signing proceeded in tense silence. I watched as Greg's pen moved across each document, formalizing a deal he didn't realize was with his own cousin. With each signature, control of Sinclair Logistics shifted incrementally back toward its rightful heir. After the final page was complete, Thomas collected the documents and handed them to one of his associates. "Congratulations, Mr. Sinclair. I believe this partnership will prove beneficial for all parties." Greg ignored the platitude. "Now, as agreed, who's really behind Phoenix Capital?" Thomas glanced at me, a silent question in his eyes. I gave a slight nod. It was time. Phoenix Capital was created for a single purpose, Thomas explained, to invest in Sinclair Logistics on behalf of its primary benefactor. He paused, allowing the tension to build. "Richard Sinclair." Greg's face went blank with confusion. "What? Dad's been dead for nearly a year." "Yes," Thomas agreed. "But his financial planning extended well beyond his lifetime. Phoenix Capital was established using funds he set aside specifically for this contingency. The need to rescue the company from mismanagement, while ensuring it eventually returned to the family member he always intended to lead it." Realization dawned slowly on Greg's face, replaced quickly by fury as he turned to me. "You knew. This whole time you knew." "Not about Phoenix Capital," I replied honestly. "But yes, I knew Dad had made other arrangements beyond what was in the official will." "The parking lot," Greg said, understanding finally breaking through. "It wasn't just a worthless piece of land, was it? What's there? What did he hide?" I met his gaze steadily. "Why don't I show you?" 2 hours later, Greg stood in the center of the underground vault, his expression cycling between awe, envy, and bitter comprehension as he took in the cars, the art, the clear evidence of my father's meticulous planning. "All of this," he murmured, "all this time. He built this whole secret life, this empire, and told you about it, but not me." "He didn't tell me either," I corrected gently. "He left clues, breadcrumbs for me to follow, because he knew I would." "And the community center upstairs?" "Part of his vision. He left plans, funding, everything needed to transform the parking lot into something meaningful for the neighborhood." Greg wandered over to the desk, trailing his fingers along its polished surface. "Why?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Why did he trust you with all this, but not me?" I considered my answer carefully. The easy response would be to throw his years of selfishness and superficiality back at him, to twist the knife of his exclusion. But standing there, surrounded by the evidence of my father's true legacy, pettiness seemed beneath us both. "Because you wanted what Dad had," I said finally. "But I wanted who Dad was. You saw the trappings of success. The penthouse, the company, the status. I saw the man who created those things, who worked and sacrificed and planned. Dad knew that difference. He knew you'd flaunt wealth, while I'd protect it, use it purposefully." Greg looked around the vault again, seeing it with new eyes. "And now? What happens now?" "Now we have choices to make," I replied. "You're still CEO of Sinclair Logistics. I'm now on the board. We can fight each other for control, drag this all into the courts, waste years and millions on litigation. Or what? Or we can work together, save the company, honor Dad's legacy, His real legacy, not just the public face of it. Greg's laugh was hollow. Work together? After everything that's happened? After how I treated you? Yes, I said simply. Because that's what Dad would have wanted. He didn't exclude you entirely, Greg. He gave you the chance to prove yourself with the company, to show what kind of leader you could be. And I failed spectacularly, Greg admitted, the self-awareness surprising me. Lost major accounts, burned through cash reserves, alienated key employees. You tried to run the company the way you thought a CEO should, with flash and ego. But that wasn't how Dad built it. He led with substance, with genuine relationships, with long-term thinking. Greg was quiet for a long moment, processing everything. I don't know if I can be that kind of leader. Maybe not alone, I acknowledged. But you don't have to be alone anymore. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable exactly, but it held possibility. The first fragile bridge, across years of competition and resentment. Finally, Greg extended his hand. Partners, then? At least until we figure out if we can actually work together without killing each other? I took his hand, feeling the weight of my father's hopes in the gesture. Partners. The next morning, we held an emergency board meeting at Sinclair Logistics headquarters. Greg opened with a surprisingly candid assessment of the company's situation, the lost accounts, the cash flow problems, the declining morale. Then he introduced me, not as his disinherited cousin, but as the newest board member representing Phoenix Capital's interests. Maggie brings a perspective this company has been missing, he said, the words clearly difficult but sincere. A connection to our founding principles, our core values. With her guidance and the financial support of Phoenix Capital, I believe we can right this ship. The other board members, mostly my father's old friends and business associates, looked between us with varying degrees of surprise and skepticism. They had witnessed our rivalry for years. This sudden alliance seemed improbable at best. But as the meeting progressed, as we outlined our initial recovery strategy, their doubt gradually transformed into cautious optimism. By the time we adjourned, there was a palpable sense of renewed energy in the room. That went better than expected, Greg acknowledged as we gathered our papers, though Jenkins looked like he was waiting for one of us to reveal it was all an elaborate prank. I smiled. Can you blame him? Last he heard, you were laughing at my parking lot inheritance. Greg winced. About that, I was an ass. I'm sorry, Maggie. Not just for that day, but for, well, a lot of things over the years. The apology was unexpected and clearly genuine. Thank you, I said simply, not quite ready to absolve years of behavior with easy forgiveness, but acknowledging the effort it took to make this first step. As we walked out, together, passing through the open plan office where employees watched our exit with undisguised curiosity, Greg asked quietly, the vault, the assets, how much are we talking about exactly? More than enough, I replied. But that's a conversation for another day. Let's focus on saving the company first. Greg nodded, accepting the boundary. Fair enough. One impossible task at a time. That evening, I returned to the vault alone, needing time to process the day's events. The rapid shift from adversaries to reluctant allies with Greg was disorienting. I wasn't naive enough to believe that years of resentment and competition could be erased in a single day, but I also couldn't deny the surprising relief I felt at the possibility of reconciliation. I sat at the desk, looking at my father's photo. Is this what you wanted all along, Dad? I asked the empty room. For us to find a way to work together? There was no answer, of course, but as I glanced around at everything he had built, both the public company and this private sanctuary, I thought I understood. Dad hadn't just been planning for the preservation of wealth, or even for my financial security. He'd been planning for redemption, for the family, for the company, and perhaps even for Greg. The next day, construction continued on the community center above. I met with Daniela and other neighborhood representatives to review progress and discuss programming plans for when the facility opened. You seem different today, Daniela observed as we walked the site together. Lighter, somehow. I smiled. Let's just say a burden I've been carrying has shifted. Not gone entirely, but reconfigured. Good, she said decisively. You've been doing too much alone. No one should have to carry everything by themselves. Her words stayed with me as I drove to the Sinclair Logistics offices later that afternoon for my first official day as a board member. The company occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in Midtown, all chrome and glass and expensive minimalism. It was a far cry from the scrappy warehouse where Dad had started the business. with its concrete floors and fluorescent lighting. Greg met me in the lobby, oddly nervous as he escorted me upstairs. "I've had them prepare an office for you," he said. "Nothing fancy, but somewhere you can work when you're here." The office, it turned out, had been my father's. Untouched since his death, it still held his collection of shipping industry models, the family photos on his desk, even the battered leather chair he'd refused to replace despite its obvious wear. "I couldn't bring myself to use it," Greg admitted. "Couldn't bear to see someone else in his place. But it should be yours now." The gesture moved me more than I cared to admit. "Thank you," I said, running my fingers along the desk's edge, feeling the small nick where Dad's watch had repeatedly struck the wood over decades of animated conversations. "There's something else," Greg said, reaching into his jacket pocket and withdrawing a small blue box. "I found this in the penthouse safe. It has your name on it." Inside the box was a simple gold locket, antique in design. When opened, it revealed a tiny photograph of my mother, smiling in the summer sun. "Dad wore this around his neck every day," I whispered, memories flooding back. "On a long chain under his shirts. No one knew except me. After Mom died, it was his way of keeping her close." "There's a note," Greg pointed out, indicating a small folded paper nestled in the box. I opened it with trembling fingers. "Maggie, when the time comes for you to take your rightful place, wear this. Remember that true wealth isn't what we display to others, but what we hold close to our hearts. Dad." I closed my hand around the locket, feeling its weight, not just the physical gold, but the legacy it represented, the love it contained. "Are you okay?" Greg asked, genuinely concerned. I nodded, not trusting my voice immediately. After a moment, I managed, "He knew. Somehow he knew exactly how everything would unfold." "Not everything," Greg corrected. "He couldn't have predicted that we'd end up working together instead of tearing each other apart in court. Couldn't he?" I wondered, thinking of the elaborate plan Dad had constructed, the way he'd set up both the conflict and the potential for resolution. "I'm beginning to think your uncle was playing a much longer game than either of us realized." 1 year later, I stood on the rooftop garden of the completed Red Hook Community Center, watching the sun set over Manhattan's glittering skyline. The space had been transformed beyond even my father's original vision. What had once been a forgotten parking lot was now a thriving hub of activity, with educational programs, art exhibitions, green space, and community services all coexisting in harmonious purpose. Below the surface, the vault remained, though I'd relocated most of the vehicles and art to more appropriate facilities. The underground space now housed the center's archives, additional learning areas, and a small museum dedicated to Red Hook's industrial history, including the story of Sinclair Logistics' humble beginnings in the neighborhood. The center's opening gala was scheduled to begin in an hour. Guests would soon arrive, community members, local officials, business leaders, and of course, the board and key employees of Sinclair Logistics. It would be the first public acknowledgement of the connection between the company and the foundation that funded the center. "There you are," came a voice from behind me. "Should have known you'd be hiding up here instead of fussing with last-minute details." I turned to see Veronica approaching, elegant in a dark green evening gown. "Not hiding," I corrected with a smile. "Just taking a moment to appreciate how far we've come." "It's remarkable," she agreed, joining me at the railing. "Both the center and the company. When you first told me about your father's hidden vault, I never imagined we'd end up here." Sinclair Logistics had indeed undergone a remarkable transformation. The infusion of capital from Phoenix Capital had stabilized the immediate crisis, but it was the changes in leadership approach that had truly revitalized the company. Greg remained CEO, but with a dramatically different style. Less flash, more substance, guided by a genuine commitment to the values that had made the company successful in the first place. My role had expanded from board member to active advisor, focusing particularly on employee welfare and community impact. Together, Greg and I had managed to retain key staff, rebuild client relationships, and even expand into new markets that leveraged technological innovations my father had been exploring before his death. "Any word from Thomas?" Veronica asked, breaking into my reflections. "He called this morning. He's in London, closing that deal with the European Transport Consortium." Thomas had transitioned from his mysterious role as Phoenix Capital's representative to a formal position as Sinclair Logistics' head of international development. His military Background and years of observing my father's business practices made him uniquely qualified for global expansion efforts. And Greg? Is he ready for tonight's announcement? I nodded. As ready as he'll ever be. It's a big step, publicly acknowledging the Foundation's connection to the company. Tonight, we would officially unveil the Sinclair Legacy Foundation as a fully funded corporate social responsibility arm of Sinclair Logistics, with dedicated resources for community development projects beyond Red Hook. Ms. Sinclair? A young staff member appeared at the rooftop entrance. The first guests are arriving, and Mr. Sinclair is looking for you. Thank you, Jamie. Tell him I'll be right down. After the staff member departed, Veronica gave me a knowing look. Still Mr. Sinclair? And Ms. Sinclair after all this time? The formality seems a bit much given everything you've been through together. I shrugged. Old habits. We're better than we were, but we're still finding our way. Some days are easier than others. Downstairs, the center's main hall had been transformed for the gala. Soft lighting illuminated the space, highlighting the architectural features that blended industrial elements with warm, welcoming design. Local artists' works adorned the walls, and catering staff circulated with trays of hors d'oeuvres prepared by a culinary program the center had established for neighborhood youth. Greg stood near the entrance, greeting guests with a warmth that would have seemed foreign on him a year ago. When he spotted me, he excused himself and made his way. Over. There you are. Nervous? He asked. A little, I admitted. You? Terrified, he said with surprising candor. Public speaking was easier when I was just spouting corporate buzzwords. Actually meaning what I say is much harder. I laughed. Welcome to authenticity. It's messy but worth it. As the hall filled with guests, I circulated, greeting community members, thanking donors, and introducing neighbors to business associates. Daniela arrived with several other local leaders, all of whom had been instrumental in shaping the center's programs to truly serve community needs. You did it, Daniela said, embracing me warmly. When you first showed me those plans a year ago, I wanted to believe, but she shook her head, looking around at the vibrant space filled with diverse attendees. This is beyond what any of us imagined. We did it, I corrected. This center belongs to Red Hook. I just helped facilitate it. At precisely 8 o'clock, Eddie gently tapped a glass to signal for attention. The crowd quieted as he welcomed everyone and briefly outlined the evening's program before introducing Greg as the first speaker. Greg approached the podium with the confident stride I'd always associated with him, but his expression held a humility I was still getting used to seeing. Thank you all for coming tonight, he began. Many of you know me as the CEO of Sinclair Logistics, a company my uncle built from nothing into one of the city's most respected businesses. For years, I thought I understood what made that company successful: strategic decisions, market positioning, brand recognition. He paused, his gaze finding mine in the crowd. I was wrong. What I failed to understand, what my cousin Maggie always knew, was that the true foundation of Sinclair Logistics wasn't its balance sheet or its client list. It was the community it served, the people it employed, the values it embodied. Murmurs rippled through the audience as many heard for the first time the acknowledgement of our family connection and my role in the company. The Red Hook Community Center represents the heart of those values, Greg continued. And tonight, I'm proud to announce that Sinclair Logistics is formalizing its commitment to community investment through the Sinclair Legacy Foundation, which will extend the work begun here to other neighborhoods where our company operates. Applause filled the room, growing louder as Greg gestured for me to join him at the podium. I moved forward, conscious of the eyes following me, the whispers of those connecting dots, realizing that the supposedly disinherited daughter had been integral to both the center and the company all along. My cousin Maggie will serve as the foundation's executive director, Greg announced. No, one is better qualified to lead this initiative, to ensure that as our company grows, we never lose sight of the principles that matter most. As I took my place beside him, Greg lowered his voice, speaking just for me. Dad would be proud of you. Of us, maybe, but definitely of you. I blinked back unexpected tears. It was the first time Greg had ever acknowledged that his uncle might have had reason to be proud of me, and perhaps the first genuine compliment he'd given me since we were children. Taking the microphone, I gazed out at the assembled guests, community members who had initially viewed me with skepticism, business associates who had dismissed me as irrelevant, friends who had supported me through the darkest days after my father's death. Thank you. I began, my voice steady, despite the emotion tightening my throat. This center, and the foundation it has inspired, represents something my father understood deeply. Real inheritance isn't measured in what you're given, but in what you're ready to carry forward. From the back of the room, I spotted Thomas, who had apparently made it back from London just in time. He nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement of how far we'd come. A year ago, I stood in an abandoned parking lot, holding a rusty key and wondering what possible value it could have. I continued. Today, I understand that the most precious legacies are often hidden from view, not in penthouse apartments or corner offices, but in the values we live by, the communities we nurture, and the differences we make in others' lives. As I spoke, I touched the gold locket hanging around my neck, my father's final gift, a reminder of what truly matters. In that moment, I could almost feel his presence, his quiet approval of how his elaborate plan had unfolded. Not exactly as he had designed it, perhaps. Greg and I had found a middle path, neither the complete estrangement my father might have anticipated, nor the total reconciliation he might have hoped for. We were still cousins with fundamentally different perspectives, still capable of frustrating each other immensely, but we had found a way to honor his legacy together, each contributing our unique strengths to preserve what mattered most. After the speeches concluded and the formal program gave way to music and mingling, I slipped away briefly to the rooftop garden once more. The night air was cool, the city lights twinkling across the water like earthbound stars. Hiding again? Greg's voice came from behind me. Reflecting, I corrected, not turning around. It's been quite a year. He joined me at the railing, respecting my space, but close enough for conversation. That it has. After a moment, he added, I sold the penthouse, by the way. The paperwork finalized yesterday. This surprised me. Really? I thought you loved that place. It was never mine, not really. Greg's gaze was fixed on the distant skyline, where the building that had housed our father's penthouse stood among the midtown towers. I was playing a part there, trying to be something I'm not. And what are you, Greg? Now, I mean. He considered the question seriously, still figuring that out. But something more real than I was before. Something more, I don't know, substantive. The admission touched me. Dad would be pleased to hear that. Maybe. Greg's smile was wistful, though I suspect he'd be more amused that his elaborate scheme actually worked. I laughed softly. True. He always did enjoy being the smartest person in the room. We stood in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching the city, each lost in our own thoughts. We should get back, I finally said. People will be looking for us. Greg nodded, but as I turned to leave, he asked, Do you think you'll ever tell everyone the whole story? About the vault, the secret assets, all of it? I considered the question. Someday, perhaps, when it feels right. For now, I'm content with knowing the truth. Ourselves. As we returned to the gala, moving among guests who now saw us as partners rather than rivals, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed in a single year. From the devastating moment in the lawyer's office to this night of celebration and purpose, the journey had been far more complex and ultimately more rewarding than I could have imagined. My father, in his final act of paternal guidance, had given me not just wealth and property, but a challenge, a purpose, and ultimately, a reconciliation I hadn't known I needed. He'd seen what Greg and I could become, individually and together, if pushed past our comfortable assumptions about each other. Later that night, after the last guests had departed and the center stood quiet in the moonlight, I descended alone to the vault one final time. The space was largely empty now, its treasures relocated or repurposed, but it still held the essence of my father's vision, the perfect blend of practicality and sentiment that had defined his approach to life. I placed my hand on the desk where I'd first discovered his letter, feeling the smooth wood beneath my fingers. You were right, Dad, I said to the empty room. About everything. About what matters. About what lasts. In my mind, I could almost hear his response. Not words, exactly, but the warm certainty of his approval, his pride in what we'd built from what he'd left behind. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm. Inside the vault, surrounded by the echoes of my father's careful planning, I finally felt at peace with his legacy, both what he'd given me and what I'd created from it. The parking lot he'd left me, dismissed as worthless by those who couldn't see beyond the surface, had contained everything that truly mattered: purpose, security, and the foundation for a future built on values rather than appearances. In the end, I hadn't needed the penthouse or the official company to honor my father's memory. I'd only needed to understand what he'd always known, that true wealth isn't what can be flaunted to others, but what we build with intention, preserve with wisdom, and share with purpose. That was the real inheritance. Not what was given, but what was discovered. Not what was claimed, but what was created. And it had been there all along, waiting beneath the asphalt, behind the rusted gate, exactly where my father knew I would find it.